Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear Hyatt, dear Omid, dear Bente, I would like to welcome you all very cordially to this Böll.Global event. This is an event that focuses on Syria, and we chose the title Syria, What Hasn't Been Lost Yet. The situation is dire, but nevertheless, we do not only want to talk about the frustrating situation, but we also want to look ahead and talk about what has not yet been lost in Syria. A country like Syria is not high on top of the agenda anymore, despite the current situation on the ground. And despite the urgency, we cannot say that it's high on top of the agenda. When it comes to EU meetings, the EU meeting with Biden, for example, my impression was that Syria was not really a major issue, and at the G7 meeting, neither. And during the Biden-Putin meeting yesterday, Syria supposedly was on the agenda, but I think we will be able to talk about it later, that there is nothing positive to report which would help to improve the situation of the Syrians. In Syria, and this is what we've already focused on in many other events already, serious crimes against human rights are being committed. More than half of the population is fleeing, and more than 130,000 people were or became victims of forced disappearances. 11 million people are completely dependent on humanitarian aid. The way in which the regime wages a war against the own population and the way in which other actors are involved is actually questioning the capacity to act of the United Nations. Insofar, Syria we see a conflict which has always had a global dimension. In view of the crimes against humanity, it's cynical when governments like the Danish government, governed by social democrats, not right-wing forces, revoke or want to revoke or actually revoked, this is the right way to put it, revoked the protective status of Syrian refugees. And also the German Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer, talks about it time and again. The people who fled here and in order to find refuge cannot be sure that this ban on deportations will continue. And tonight, we want to focus on the political and economic situation in Syria, which is becoming more and more dramatic. And according to estimates of the United Nations, more than 80% of the Syrians are living below the poverty threshold. 11 million Syrians, I already mentioned that, are dependent on humanitarian aid. And this is why we will also talk about humanitarian aid tonight, how we can safeguard humanitarian aid. And we will in particular focus on the fact that the mandate of the United Nations for the cross-border humanitarian aid will end at July the 11th, irrespective of the pandemic and all other factors. So this makes it the more necessary for us to talk about the situation and how can we prevent the fact that Russia, or how can we prevent the closure of the last border crossing point. And tonight, and I hope we will have enough time for it, we will also talk about the responsibility of the European Union, in particular for the refugees in Europe. But we would also like to look ahead and talk about what can German or European politics do in order to prevent further exacerbation of the situation. These are the topics I would like to talk about with my three guests, and I'm quite happy that I can welcome Hyatt. Hyatt is a Syrian columnist He is a senior consultant research fellow of the Chatham House Program of Middle East and North Africa. And before that, Hyatt worked as a program manager for Syria and Iraq in our Middle East department in Beirut. And he also worked as a senior community service protection assistant in Damascus, and today he lives in London. Hyatt, I'm quite happy that you're our guest today. You are closely connected in Syria, and I'm happy that you're here. Welcome to you. Then I would also like to welcome Omid Nouripur. Omid Nouripur has been member of Alliance 90, the Greens in the German Bundestag since 2006. Since 2013, has been the foreign policy spokesperson of the parliamentary group. He's also a member of the Foreign Committee, also the Committee for Humanitarian Aid, and also a representative or deputy chairman in the Defense Committee. Omid, I'm quite glad that you joined us at this hot day in Berlin, and we are looking forward to your impressions from the parliamentarian work in the German Bundestag. And last but not least, also a warm welcome to Bente Scheller. Bente works for the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin, and she's the head of the Middle East and North Africa division from 2012 to 2019. She's been the head of our office in Beirut, and before that of our office in Afghanistan. So you have already experienced many crises spots. Between 2002 and 2004, Bente Scheller was also a spokesperson at the German embassy in Damascus. And I think that over the years, you deserve the title to be a Syria expert, so to speak. I'm quite happy that we will discuss today, and in 3 rounds, we will try to shed a light on 3 different aspects. The first round will focus on the political and the economic situation, in particular in the context of the pandemic. The state budgets in Syria are empty. Inflation is increasing dramatically, and in many cities, and many people living here do not know it, in many cities there's scarcity of food, so hunger is on the rise. And the Assad regime itself is actually increasingly fighting with the fact that, or struggling with the fact that loyal communities can hardly be taken care of in terms of food supplies. So those who have been loyal to the regime, obviously for them, this is already a problem. So the circle of loyal people who can be taken care of is getting smaller. So obviously good connections to the state representatives is not sufficient to get supplies because there's not a sufficient supply. So Hyatt, I would like to ask you to describe us the situation. You're from Atareb, which is in the Idlib province, and you have conducted several analyses on the domestic dynamics in Syria, but also on the question of a return to Syria. So you're an expert, even though you are currently living in London. So please describe to us the horrible economic situation and its impact for the population in the different provinces. Thank you for being here, Hyatt. I'm looking forward to your statement.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, for attending this online panel. Well, the situation, as you described, is quite bad throughout Syria. The reasons might be different from one area to another. Let's start with areas controlled by the regime. There are various reasons for their economic situation there. First of all, there is corruption, lack of economic activities. There's the decline of the currency, and there's the crisis in the neighboring country, Lebanon, and there's the de-risking that many banks and entities are going through due to sanctions as well. So due to different reasons, people in regime-controlled areas are struggling to secure basic needs. And as you mentioned, that the regime's inability to provide basic services and essential commodities has led to severe shortages, especially when it comes to fuel and bread, and those are essential not only for the day-to-day life, but also for the productivity of the country in general. I'll come back to this and discuss the impact of that on local loyalist communities and communities living under the control of the regime in a second. But the situation is similar in other areas as well. When we talk about the Northeast, people there are also suffering from shortages, especially when it comes to bread and essential services. Now there is drought and lack of water in that region, which increases the difficulties and suffering of people there. In Idlib and areas around there, the situation is even worse because of, first of all, you have the security situation that is bad there, and the shelling that has restarted again from the regime side, and then lack of activities. But then also, on top of that, many donors have stopped their support to that area because of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and many still think that is still affiliated with Al-Qaeda and other radical groups. Now, when we talk about, so what does that mean for regime-controlled areas? I think there are a few issues that I will quickly highlight, and then maybe we can discuss them later on. One issue is that has impacted the daily sort of living standards of local communities there. So now one issue is lack of support, but then the other issue is due to, as you said, that the regime doesn't have much money. So instead of supporting vulnerable peoples, the regime is increasing the prices of basic commodities like fuel and bread. And on top of that, the regime is reducing the quantities of support, especially subsidized commodities to locals. Then there is another issue which is related to the infighting between regime inner circle figures due to lack of resources. What happened with Makhlouf recently and others is just an example. So this highlights that the tension that is increasing not only between locals who live in those areas and who cannot afford to actually just make ends meet, but also it's impacting the inner circle of the regime, whether we're talking about loyalist militias who are fighting each other in order to secure some extra cash, or we're talking about loyalist businessmen who have controlled the economy for decades in Syria, and now they're fighting over what's left of it. And then you have people in different regions like Suwaida and others who are demonstrating, or at least every now and then they demonstrate because of lack of services. Now, the majority of that sort of anger is mostly expressed online, and the regime is using different security measures to prevent people from expressing their frustration on the streets. Now we don't know until when that will happen, but we will most likely see more security measures and more detention and more violation from the regime side in order to make sure that that sort of public anger will not be illustrated in the street in front of the eyes of the world. I'll stop here.
First of all, thank you very much. So in Idlib alone, 1.4 million people have to be receive food supplies on a daily basis. I think it would be great, Hayat, if you told us what a food ratio per day means. What does it mean in concrete terms to get food supplies? So to get food supplies doesn't mean that you get sufficient food supplies or you get sufficient nutrition. So how does such a food supply look like for the general population in the regions that are controlled by the government, by the regime?
Sure. So the food supplies, usually we talk about food baskets that contain mostly rice, beans, and other sort of essential commodities that would be essential for people to survive. But as you said, it will not include all the nutrition that people need in order to have a healthy sort of life. Now, even those portions that are given to undistributed are not enough because of the lack of funding that many organizations are going through, including UN agencies, because of, again, the lack of interest in Syria in general. So donors are not as keen to donate as before. So on the one hand, you have small portions that are being distributed that are not enough, or at least don't meet the daily sort of standard of nutrition. And then on the other hand, you have big families that are not able to provide other sort of commodities, essential commodities like fruits or vegetables or meat or milk and others that are essential, especially for kids. So instead of being able to complement the basket with other sort of essential commodities, what they do is they depend on that basket, and they will, to that extent possible, try to only buy bread because usually they cannot afford anything else. If they have to pay extra for electricity because there is no electricity provided by any of the main actors, or at least if it's provided, it's only for a short period of time. So they have to pay extra for that from private service providers. They have to pay extra for water, they have to pay extra for rent, and then they have to pay extra for that to secure their areas or to provide for other sort of health issues and stuff like that. So at the end, they really don't have much money, and the only thing that they at some point might be able to afford is the bread to be able to just survive. And due to the shortages when it comes to bread as well, then the price will increase and people will not be able to buy even enough bread to feed their families. And that's why we are talking about a hunger problem across Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much so far. I think we should also dive deeper into this topic. So this bad situation also in the regime-controlled areas, I think it's very important to mention that, but I think we should also discuss other aspects. So Syria, of course, is also heavily affected by the pandemic. There are hardly any reliable figures on the number of people who are affected by the pandemic. And of course, the regime also tries to conceal the number of people who have died due to the pandemic. So Bente, I would like to ask you, how can we get one or the other information on the pandemic in Syria? I mean, we do not only see a devastating situation in terms of food supply, but also in terms of health services. So how does this affect the population? How does it affect the male population or women? Well, of course, the pandemic came on top of the general crisis, so all the factors that Hyde has just described, so discrepancies in the distribution and the shortcomings in terms of the supply have been reinforced and increased. And one of the factors is the mismanagement of the regime, which should have noticed at an early point how relevant the pandemic is going to be. Iran, with whom they have close relations, has already noticed at an early stage how severe the pandemic might be. However, the regime in Syria has not taken any precautions. It shows quite an erratic behavior. And of course, criminal structures are being reinforced, and what we see is an unequal distribution of burden sharing, so to speak, between the sexes. And hospitals have been destroyed. The most vulnerable see less and less services and care, and in the course of the overall burden that everyone has to shoulder, women have become more and more important in their families because many men were disappeared, forced disappearances, they were detained, they died in the war. So this is why women have to shoulder more and more responsibility and always a greater burden. And they have also shown that they can do it, but the pandemic now came on top of it. And at the same time, the scarce resources that are being used for health services are being deviated into those areas that take care of the fight against the pandemic. So this has an effect on reproductive issues and reproductive health services, etc., which is not that obvious. And in terms of domestic violence, I mean, we have seen throughout the world what the lockdown means in terms of domestic violence on top of that, or in connection with economic hardships, etc. So this, of course, affects not only Syrian women in Syria, but also in the large refugee camps, also in Lebanon.
And did Assad really take care of any vaccination programs? Are vaccines available for people? Who are those people? How are they distributed? Or, of course, it's a lot more than just the vaccine that we need. The strategy of the regime has always been ignorance and concealment and do as if. So the same applies to the vaccination. And of course, the sanctions are the ones responsible for the vaccines not reaching the country. This is not the case. There are mechanisms that he could have chosen to obtain more vaccination, more vaccines, and then he was always counting on Russia militarily, and Russia was quite active, but on the civil sphere and in the healthcare sector, not really that much. So we see we only have very few vaccination doses that have reached the country from China, but Russia only delivered after they have found a country with Israel that somebody came up for the cost of the vaccine. I've read the number that only 72% doses have reached the country. 72,000, yeah. That's the same number that I have heard, and more have been, well, at least promised, but once they reach the country, we don't really know what happens, because with the electricity crisis and the mismanagement, of course, can lead to the fact that a big number of those doses cannot be used. So we don't have any reliable figures, only very few. And every figure that we hear, we really don't know what the positive impact will be in the end, because we have those favorable networks that will be taken, although we take advantage of those deliveries. Thank you, Bente. We will keep on talking. And now, Ahmed, over to you. Can you tell us to what extent the devastating economic crisis with increasing hunger, massive problems in the healthcare provision, are those issues important for you in your humanitarian committee? Is this even an issue? Are people talking about this in the parliament? How would you assess the situation? Thank you so much for the invitation, for the possibility to discuss this issue. It's really important to raise awareness. Of course, Syria is a topic in our Foreign Affairs Committee, but this happens behind closed doors, and we need a lot more attention. We need more attention for so many different things, for the funding of humanitarian aid, for this in 2533, the resolution that this can be extended. And if we don't have awareness, then of course there's no pressure. Nothing's going to change on the ground. So the situation is, for the last 10 years, basically, it's devastating. And we've seen an aggravation, an exacerbation of the situation. We just heard it. And people who would need humanitarian aid was 11 million last year. So now this has risen to 13.5 million. And this is huge. And this, of course, has to do with the corona pandemic and the mismanagement. And it has to do with the way the politics work, the way Bente described it, that humanitarian aid usually reaches those people that are favoring the regime, of course. So this has led to an impoverishment of the whole publicity. We have 6 million IDPs, internally displaced people, something that we totally forget. This is very inside information. IDPs are the internally displaced people. So we're talking about 6 million people that have lost their homes and simply didn't have the possibility to leave the country. So they're displaced inside their countries. And this is horrible. And I have to say so at this point. I don't know if this is a fitting moment, but we had few moments that were less or more cynical when we heard about the elections. We have seen the people in the election offices, and we all know them. And now, and our parliamentarians from the right-wing party said that now we have a democratic state and now we don't have any refugee worth situation anymore. This is ridiculous, and we really have to keep on working and not give up. And if we may tip it up to the title, what has not been lost, we still have many, many people on the ground. Every day, many, many horrible things are happening on the ground, and it keeps on going. But we still have millions of people that still have a right for a decent life. And we can still help them. This is our major objective, of course. Yeah, I think it is a good idea to talk about the elections in the media coverage. It has been displayed as if Assad would have this huge support in the areas controlled by him. Maybe you can give us a bit more insight, a few more details, and Bente and Hyatt as well, about the legitimization of those elections. Would you like to say something about the election and the whole complex of the support of Assad, and that what's been said, things are becoming more and more normal? I don't think this is the case, but I would like to hear from you, Hyatt or Bente, who else wants to. So, but this is not the first election that is a total, a bogus election. I can only see with a lot of cynicism that this is the only election that is even less free and less independent than the elections in Iran. And we know that those people are in the center of the regime that have lost, and all the other candidates or real alternatives had been excluded previously already. And the democratic opposition, I wouldn't tell anybody to go to Damascus and enter an electoral campaign, because they would be stopped at the airport already. And all those people that could have voted and weren't able to do so are those people testifying that this has been really a bad show. And you need a lot of bad will or a lot of naiveness in order to believe that those elections have been free and voluntary. Hyatt, would you like to say something about the presidential election campaign and the elections and how it is received here in the large community of exiled people in Europe?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think in general that the majority of Syrians, whether inside or outside of Syria, have not been able to, first of all, be able to make their voices heard, because, for example, despite the legitimacy of the regime and the few candidates that were sort of pre-selected by Bashar in order to ensure his win at the end of the process, you see that there were no elections or voting centers in opposition held areas, the majority of people there said that we don't want that. Even in northeastern Syria, the area that is controlled by the self-administration, which has better relationship with the regime, also the majority of areas there were not allowed to, they don't want to, but also they didn't have voting centers, and the authorities there said this, we don't recognize the elections there. When we talk about even areas within regime controlled, under the control of the regime, people there refuse. For example, in Daraa, in Quneitra, and many other places, people attacked the voting centers and prevented them. They forced them to leave the area because they said we don't recognize this. But now the question in many countries in Europe, for sure, people didn't want to vote, and there were no voting centers. But I think what's important to highlight here is that the regime has been using campaigns to force people to, especially in areas under its control, but also in Lebanon, to go and vote. In areas under the control of the regime, for example, if you are a government employee or if you are a student, then there are people there who will be forcing you, and then they have list of names, and if you don't show up, then they will report you, and then you will be at the risk of detention. In Lebanon, I was in Lebanon in 2014, and I saw firsthand how Hezbollah people and many people affiliated with the regime, they were going to different camps in order to force people to go and vote, and many people had no choice but to go and vote. Despite that percentage of people who voted in Lebanon was quite small in comparison to the number of refugees there. So in general, there is no for sure recognition for the elections by the majority of Syrians, not only those who are outside, but also those who are inside the country. The main problem here is that there is no way for them to be able to express their opinions without fearing the consequences of such actions. Thank you.
Now I have to unmute myself. Binta, please, would you give us a short overview or to add on what's been said by Omid and Hyde? And then I will talk about the 10th of July and the next mandate that is finished for the last border crossing. Omid said it all seemed to believe that everything is back to normal, and it was interesting. Thought it was interesting to see the pictures. We had needles even in the electoral offices where those ballot papers could be signed with their own blood. And I think this is something that gives at least the image of the modern president, of the president is not really supported. And this is a close message to the extent to which the loyalty really goes until death. And I think it was a message from the regime to Russia, because they want to support the constituting process, and it is in the international interest. And by having organize those elections according to their own conditions, the regime showed quite clearly that Russia has no right and no power to force us to follow the process. Bent, I would like to stick to you, because I would like to talk about the question about the lacking humanitarian aid, or the very few goods that reach Syria have to cross through just one single border crossing, because the other ones had been closed down, 3 of them. And now Russia announced that this last border crossing is to be closed. And I think that the federal government has made an effort in order to keep other border crossings open, but nevertheless, Even Putin, in his talks with Biden, he did not soften and did not want to talk about the deadline and the ultimatum to keep those borders open. What does it really mean on the ground when from July on we won't have any humanitarian aid coming into the country? What does it mean when this UN mandate of the border crossings will not be prolonged? I would like to start off with you, Bente, and then Omid and Hayat. The United Nations are the most important actor to deliver humanitarian aid to Idlib. It is controlled by the rebels. And of course, we have a lot more people there in the camps that should be there, could be, and that can be supported by the resources available. And therefore, it is clear that those border crossings have to be used. Border crossings can be used by the organizations, by other organizations, but they will not be able to buffer up the amount of aid coming into the country by the UN. And with the UN mandate lacking, now it's up to Turkey to decide what will be delivered, which will be quite problematic. And what do we do with 2 to 3 million people that are already suffering? And then in the winter, at the last, we will see how devastating this will be. And this is absolutely relevant. And this is one of the effects that shows how far we've gone. The regime had the possibility always to receive humanitarian aid and to transform them into weapons because they control them, they impose sanctions for people not respecting the rules. And now by having those 2 or 3 border crossings closed, we have no data. The Kurdian areas that had their deliveries come in by the Iraq, now they are supported by Damascus, and they are quite friendly, on a friendly note with the regime, but the hospitals only receive 30% of what they received when the border crossings were open, and those are the ones working on a quite friendly level. And only one thing they have wheat, they have the cereals, fuel, and this is what helps, and therefore all the rest is dependent on the border crossings, and it is, of course, indispensable. Omid, where do you see possibilities to help to create a government alliance of many other governments in order to prolong, to extend this mandate? So taking into consideration the situation we have on the ground, how can we not do that? And this is one question. And the other question is, how can we deliver humanitarian aid to a dictator like Assad? It is a dilemma, really, because on one hand, we rely on the dictator to have the humanitarian come into the country. And on the other hand, we need this humanitarian aid. How do you deal with this dilemma? What does it really mean? And we have to act quite soon because we have to help the people on the ground, although we have to do it via the regime. It is the first time that hunger has been used in this war. And we have so many different examples of so much suffering and so many crimes against humanity, but we're talking about 3 million people suffering hunger, and this is something we haven't seen before, and this is a dimension where we don't have to have our fantasy kick, and this is something that we have to tackle. And if we don't all raise our voices and are loud enough, then we incur the risk that help is coming when it's already too late. And so I think we have to act right now. This is what people try to do in the last month. I'm not a big fan of the German federal government, but the Germans have expressed this need quite clearly in the UN Security Council to the veto countries. And 1 border crossing for 3 million people, this is already quite difficult to achieve. But if we now have this last border crossing closed, then it can only have one objective, that the hunger leads to the people giving up, and then Assad can claim the victory. And this on the back of millions of people that live there, civilians, people, women. This is unbearable. What can we do? Just simply speak out loud and to remind the Russians that they have approved the sanctions. We had 3 resolutions in the past where the Russians were on board, and now this resolution has been prolonged. And they said, since the war's over, now things can go via Damascus without any problem. And then we get to the dilemma that you described. The dilemma is permanently ongoing. Carsten Wieland wrote in his book that is called The Neutrality Trap that the money usually reach the people where they're simply not further distributed. And now I think we should work with what we have, and we only have one means of action, one leverage right now, and that is the question of recovery. And the question of the repatriation of people. At the same time, we have to pay for the reconstruction, that we can blackmail us with the refugees, that let me assume that it will be the European countries that have to come up for the construction. This is not something that we should keep away, but the release of more than 100,000 of prisoners of war. I'm sorry that the connection is really bad. Oh, he is frozen all the time. No, I can't hear him anymore. Is he frozen or am I?
Well, it seems to be Omid. Omid, I'm sure you will join us again in a second, but now I would like to seize the opportunity to pass the floor to Hayat. So we have talked about the Syrian regime and how they limit the health services and instrumentalize food supplies, use it as a weapon. So it would be great if you could tell us in concrete terms what it means. For example, Bente already touched upon it in the Kurdish regions, in other areas that are considered insurgent areas. So what is the regime doing there in concrete terms, in terms of this instrumentalization of food supplies and health supplies?
Sure. So for throughout the conflict, the regime has been able to manipulate aid that is being distributed from Damascus, whether through UN agencies or other international organizations working there. And that is being done through different mechanisms. One of them is preventing them from going out to the field and distributing aid directly, and naming the local partners that they have to work through, not allowing them to go and assess the needs, but also evaluate the impact of their programs, see if the beneficiaries that and the list that are submitted actually receive those assistance or not. So there are many tools that are being used by the regime in order to do that. And the main, there are two, I think, goals here. The first one is to continue to use aid as a tool to punish those who oppose the regime in the past, and especially those in regime in former rebel controlled areas, opposition areas, and to increase the legitimacy of the regime by saying that everyone is working now through Damascus. That means that now the next step would be to say that the conflict is over, and then as Omid said, that start sending refugees and reconstruction fund and all of that through Damascus, because that's the only way to do it. Now, I think the main problem here is that we have this culture of immunity that the Syrian regime and its allies have been able to enjoy throughout the conflict. Now, the Russians are doing what they are doing now because when they intervened in 2015 and they started bombarding hospitals and schools and civilians, no one did anything. And then the regime used chemical weapons more than once and no one did anything. And this is why it's clear why the Russians will be able to do that, because there are no consequences. Even when the Americans recently met them, they said, if you do this, we will cooperate with you in the future. But they didn't say that if you don't do this, we will punish you and we'll come after you, or we will prevent that money to go to Damascus. So there is no measures or consequences to the actions that the regime and the Russians are doing. And as long as that's the situation, and that's they will continue to take advantage not only of aid, but of the suffering of people there in order to increase their authority in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hayat, also for these concrete explanations, specific explanations. I would like to now start with the next topic, because it's also very important to us. At the beginning, I already mentioned that we would also like to discuss the European governments and the role of the EU. And so there's the first European governments that act as if Syria would be at peace once again, and refugees in our countries could be sent back to Syria. So Denmark, I already touched upon that, has already done that. And now I would like to ask Bente, what makes a country like Denmark assess the situation in Syria differently and to start this inhumane program to send refugees back to the country, and considering the conditions that we've just touched upon? Well, maybe they haven't really seen it, but over the past years, I think there were several examples of very hostile Danish government, hostile towards everything that is alien, especially refugees. And we have seen very many political steps, but I think our attention is highly influenced by our decision towards Syria. And of course, it's not that the situation in Syria had changed. It's not that the situation has become more secure in Syria. It's simply a political motivation of Danish politicians. I mean, this is fatal because it's quite clear into what kind of a situation people are sent back or deported. And similar to Horst Seehofer, who has said time and again, I mean, he's talking about sending back criminals and potential terrorists, but it's quite clear that many would be faced with a situation where they would have to fear for their life because the human rights situation is dire and we simply cannot deport them. So in practical terms, it's a long path which cannot be taken right now, neither by Denmark nor by Germany. But the debate, of course, creates more insecurity for the refugees here, and they see or experience that there's no guarantee, even though they managed to come here. And it's simply about domestic politics. And this is what we see in almost all European states. And what is even more important in terms of Syria is not that only that if we deported refugees to Syria, then of course we would also have to take up a relationship with the regime. But the regime doesn't want these refugees back. So Russia tried to put up the equation that Omid, you have touched upon. So some time ago, Russia said, well, if you do not want to keep the Syrian refugees in your countries, then you have to pay for the reconstruction and then you can send them back. However, the Syrian regime was against it. Russia, for example, made the attempt to send back thousands of Syrian refugees from the Lebanon. However, the regime in Syria blocked it and did not provide them with the possibility to return. And every time when Russia tried to put it up for debate and advocate this, the Syrian regime countered it and refused it. So what we tend to think as a possibility to make an offer in order to get the regime to concede and to agree is not there. It's not possible. So this is why we have only very few levers. So the regime has said that it's not going to do it. I rather wanted to accept a worse situation for everyone instead of allowing for more humanitarian aid. And this is very important in terms of the European or German policy, because for many reasons, return of the refugees cannot work out. And it's also difficult for, of course, in particular for the refugees. Thank you very much, Bente. You yourself are faced with a situation where your analyses were quoted by the Danish government in order to justify this deportation project. So it's quite cynical and quite bitter that several scientists who have been instrumentalized by the Danish government, you have sent an open letter to the Danish government. So it's crazy in kind of context that we are in right now, and in which we have to argue in favor of the law, and we are abused and instrumentalized. So this also shows the kind of culture, political culture in some of the European countries. Omid Seehofer tends to talk about criminals and potential terrorists, approximately 90 persons, according to him, that he would like to deport, but it has not yet happened. I would like to ask you now to take a look at the German political context. How far will this ban on deportations be maintained? Well, this brings me to the second half of my answer to the headline of this event, what has not yet been lost. This is our humanity. This is the rule of law, international law, the Geneva Conventions. So everything will be violated if we would deport. I've already talked to colleagues in Denmark. So in brief, it's about their fear of the far right. And in brief, Seehofer is doing the same thing. But if you are actually driven by a right-wing nationalist agenda, of course, this also changes the culture. It changes the culture in your country. And Denmark has repatriated refugees in the two-digit figures, but of course they will not gain more voters' voices. And it doesn't help to differentiate yourself from right-wing nationalist parties. The most important thing is we should look at the situation of those who have went back voluntarily. And there are reports about people who went back that they disappear, they are tortured. This is actually the reality of those who return, and we have to talk about it. And we should not be misguided by those who think that it's a political, good political strategy to deport people. Thank you very much for these clear words. I mean, this is what we experience. And in the case of Syria, we see that the Geneva Convention is constantly undermined in different contexts. And the international law is simply no longer considered binding. In this next round, I would also like to focus on the question, why is Syria not yet lost? But before we do it, Hyatt, I would like to ask you, I mean, the Syrian exilees, the exile community, how do they consider and discuss the deportation practice? And where do you think should we draw a firewall, or where do you think should we draw a red line? Where do that we do not deport to Syria?
Well, I think people in general, especially those who are outside of Syria, are terrified because of what's happening in Denmark. They saw that and they didn't believe, not only because Denmark is one of the Scandinavian countries, and at least in Syria and in the region as well, in general, people see that as one of the model states to live in. Now, people in Europe, and more importantly, in the region, in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, they are terrified that soon enough, the governments, the host governments, would start sending them back. Because if Denmark is doing that, then why would those host countries not do that? Especially that most of them didn't even sign the Refugee Convention, the 1951 convention. So now people don't know what will happen to them despite where they are, and whether they will go through something similar or not. I think that the red line that should be drawn here is that no one should be sent back against their will to Syria. As Ahmed mentioned, people went back voluntarily. Small numbers of people went back voluntarily before, and some of them were arrested. Some of them they've disappeared. Others were not able to go back to their areas of origin. They had to go to other regions not controlled by the regime, because they couldn't stay where they were, but also they couldn't go back to their homes. So they had to look for a different option. The red line is clear. People should not be sent back to Syria against their will, because the risk is real here. Now, when Denmark looks at, for example, there's no fighting, and people who don't have kids who are forced to go to conscription, those are not the only two risks that are facing Syrians there. You have many others. For example, one of them is related to anyone who was outside of the country is considered suspicious, because for leaving in the first place, that means they were not believers in the regime, and they're not loyal enough to the regime to stay and fight for the regime, or at least stay and support the regime. So that's one thing. The other thing is that many of them are losing their properties there. That's a different sort of violence that is being used against them. There are many risks that go beyond just the fighting and conscription. I think governments should look at the different formats and forms of violence that people in Syria are facing before they start saying that Syria is safe.
Yet how well can even be documented what happens with those people that return? Are there any possibilities to see or to have people understand what happens to them? Bent already said that the regime doesn't even want them back. There's no readmission willingness. Can you tell us a little bit more about the information situation? Is there anything that documents the situation of those returnees? What happens to them?
Well, in general, most of the people who go back, they don't disclose that they're going back, because they're afraid that if they, for example, go to UNHCR or other NGOs and say that they're going back, then the list will end up in the hands of the regime. So first of all, they don't report that they're going back. They try, most of them, especially those who are going from Lebanon, to cross back illegally to Syria. So first of all, we don't have the list of names of people who go back. Then in Syria, as you said, it's a black box. No one knows what happens, especially in regime-controlled areas, especially to those who change their phone numbers, or those who are scared of staying in touch with anyone who's outside. So there are many risks involved. But what we know, especially when it comes to the few individuals who went back and went through the channels, or their families reported them at a later stage, because their families are still family members, they have family members in Lebanon or elsewhere, they reported that those individuals went back to Syria and we lost contact with them. So that's, in a sense, the only sort of mechanism that we are using right now, NGOs are using, in order to track the few people that we know of, and we know that they have not been able to live in peace in Syria because of the risks and the violence that they are witnessing and living there.
Many thanks, Hayat. We already have to come to the conclusion round. I hope that we can at least try to be a bit more hopeful than despairful. Omid, he said what hasn't been lost yet. He started with a discussion saying that we still have to work for humanitarian and international law. And in your last round, I would like to give you the opportunity to all three of you to ask you what is urgently needed in order to change the humanitarian situation. Where do we have allies that could help us to do so? And I would like to start off with Bente. I would absolutely underline what's been said by Omid. We need the pressure, the public awareness in order to make a border crossing possible, crossing of the humanitarian aid. And then we have to take into consideration that those narratives don't get lost. We have worked with so many different Syrian partners, and for them it was really difficult to see that everything they stood for had been razed, and then after those military victory and those lost biographies, that the regime tries to take away their history and to declare the way it has been really. And this is something that we may not allow, and this is especially crucial for those people that are here ready, that we may not simply open up a new page and start from scratch. Pressure is one thing, solidarity is the other thing, and in the international sphere or stage, I think it is important we have to relax and to say that we may not be pressured. Russia has dictated many different conditions in terms of the humanitarian aid, and this has not led to the fact that this had a positive impact at some point. It simply led to having Russia more and more power. We have been pushed back to a corner, and the same applies to Turkey. This is not a refugee deal, but this is the way it is called, and it is quite clear Europe has become humiliated, and we, under the principle that take care, you will have more refugees coming into the countries, and we should relax because we have a refugee act and we can take care of it. And if we let the others belittle us, then we lose our values and our norms, and then of course we may not wait for the people, the right people, getting to power. I think it is important that we cannot step back. We have to keep up the power. And there are so many Syrians that have the motivation to get something moving. And this is where I see the opportunities and where the future of Syria lies. Yes, I think this is where we are quite active. And it is about organizing the penalization of those who committed the crimes and are living in Germany, and we have a cooperation with the UNHCR in order to do so. And I think this is a very important aspect. At least we would like to see the criminals sentenced. Hayat, how do you perceive Europe, the European Union, when it comes to doing everything possible that Syria and the people on the ground have a possibility to lead a decent life? Do you see that it's a way to less political will to save what is left or to organize what has not been lost?
There's definitely lack of willingness from European countries to do what they can in order to support and protect those who are outside the control of the regime inside Syria, but also refugees who live elsewhere, especially in the region, in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Now, what's not lost is the people who are still not willing to go back to Syria. And many of them are trying to create alternatives and try to live a simple life, but life that is lived without fear. And I think this is what the EU in general should focus on. I think when it comes to specific sort of measures that could be implemented, one of them would be to ensure that if Russia and the regime managed to actually close the border, then the EU, in coordination with the US and other countries, should create an alternative mechanism and ensure that that money will not go through Damascus, because if that money goes through Damascus, then it will not reach its final destination. And we saw that in the Northeast, we saw that in former opposition areas that are now under the control of the regime. And then the last thing will be to ensure that there's no normalization with the regime, because at this point, normalizing with the regime means that the regime will not only continue its violations, but actually will increase the level of those violations, because at that point, the regime knows that it's unstoppable. And if Assad himself reaches that point, there is no way back. And unfortunately, we so far have not seen enough efforts from EU countries and from the US in order to prevent that from happening. So hopefully that would change soon.
Thank you, Hayat. Omid, you have once and again referred back to the title of our event, What Hasn't Been Lost Yet, and I think that is nice to hear. So can you name 2 or 3 priorities where you say that has to happen in order to avoid the normalization or the legitimization of the regime, international law and the Geneva Convention? Where do you see possibilities for action? Yeah, you already named it all, and Ben did as well, and I'm totally grateful, because it is absolutely the way you said. I totally agree with you all, you, Bente and Hayat, and therefore I would like to seize the opportunity, or those 2 minutes, to say something else. The disaster leads to the fact that people think nothing can be done, and when you think nothing can be done, then all is lost. But as long as we can, we should do everything possible in our power. First of all, I agree totally with what's been said. The supporter countries with Assad, they may not be released. We have to confront the Russians with everything they did, and they are still doing. This is totally necessary. And then we have to protect those that refer to those facts. And I can believe that no Muslim from the Hezbollah has been slaughtered, that people need protection, and in order to this barbaric actions not taking place, and people are silenced. Then thirdly, neighboring states. The Lebanon, of course, is under a lot of pressure to say country, and I don't even know what kind of the abysm, what side of the abysm it can be found, but this goes along with a lot of pressure of the domestic policy of the people of Syria, and with this pressure not receding, then of course they might bring the people back, and then of course we have the pressure, or the Lebanese are deporting their people, because otherwise the country would implode. And we need the help of those neighboring countries. And last but not least, this is the fundamental thing of our thinking. Assad has not won peace. There's no peace with justice. There's no justice without the assimilation of war crimes. And the whole narrative that everything is good in Syria is based upon Assad having won the elections, but peace can only be reached with justice. And I'm being repetitive, but I think we may not forget that, and we have to work our way around in order to have this impunity being penalized. Many things, Omid, and I'm really glad that we try to make our contribution as a foundation to create more awareness, to increase the political pressure in order for those criminals not being here in Germany without being sentenced. And I know that you out there, our audience, didn't really have a lot, didn't really have their say. And I think we received one or the other nice comment about the deportation practice in Denmark and the function of questions and answers. They're really worthwhile to be read. And I have asked my colleague Bente to flip through the questions and to take up one or the other question because they might be similar. What kind of pressure could be exercised? And Bente, you are the one to take on this task to look into our questions. There. Different questions that are referring to documented human crimes. Caesar is the name of one of the journalists that has been tortured to death and has smuggled those pictures out to the wide public. And this is something where we can see the extent of those crimes being committed. We have more than 8,000 people documented on those pictures that have been tortured to death. And this gives us a hint what is really happening and what we are in slaughterhouse. And now we are at a certain point here in Germany where we still have some litigations ongoing that it might seem that the situation has already changed and things are finished, and it's not like that. It is still happening, and I think those photos have circulated a lot. They have been perceived by many people, have reached many important places, and one question is referring to this issue, saying, would it be possible to create a bit more awareness, to create this public awareness that those pictures could be linked to the biographies of the people, of those tortured to death? So what would be the approach of the Russians? And there's a lot of suffering that has been brought about, and we did reach this awareness thanks to the pictures, but the pressure hasn't risen, and the regime simply has not bent. And if we don't have any people in the parliament like Ahmed to say that this is still ongoing, we have not tried all the different resources, then we just simply forget about it. Spiegel has posted a few just black pictures on the website in order to remind us of Aleppo. And pictures are published and posted in order to make the extent visible. And this is all necessary, but I think this is not enough in order to have a different positioning of the regime or in order to bring a change about. I think those are the most important questions. And then we have another one about sanctions. Yeah, please take it up. Those pictures have given the Caesar Act its name. It is a sanctioned document of the US for Syria. And they said it would be really difficult for the Syrian economy, but hardly any organizations have been imposed under this act. The others are under the Magnitsky Act. We did have a lot of hopes and expectations, but there was no real effect, and it did not ruin the economy as much as the banking crisis. And now I am extending a bit our timeline because we had another question about the role of Turkey. Why don't we talk about Turkey, which is an important player on the ground when it comes to the water supplies on the ground? Ahmed, would you tell us a little bit more about the role of Turkey? Could we organize a separate event on that? Turkey has done a lot with the uptake of many millions of people. This is something that is clear that cannot be silenced. They had a rate of people that was really extraordinary. The problem is that Turkey has pushed the switch, and now it's all about the IPG and not about Syria. And this strategically has changed in terms of the positioning of Turkey. And this, of course, is a topic on its own. And of course, it would be helpful if Turkey could exercise more pressure on the Russian side when it comes to the border crossings. This is, at least according to my understanding, is not happening, which is a huge problem. It is increasingly important that we put our finger on those things when we talk to Turkey. But at the end of the day, the 10th of July is of paramount importance, and that we need the voices of China and Russia. And if the Russians don't abide by the rules, then China will do the same. And the most urgent questions will now what Russia decides. And to the end, Hayat, to you, what would be critically important for you in order to keep your hopes up in your work? You are in exile, you're closely linked or closely related to your friends and your family in Syria. What would it be that you would wish to see from us, and what do you expect from us, from the German civil society and from the German government?
Thank you. I think there's one ask that it took humanity decades in order to reach simple and few humanitarian principles and human rights principles. I think protecting those principles in order to make sure that we don't go back to those concepts, to like the jungle again. I think that's what's important. And there are different ways. Again, we mentioned only a few of them, but that is the core issue here. As long as those principles are protected, I think people will feel safe, not only in Syria but elsewhere as well. But if those principles are not protected because of Assad and few criminals like him, then the future is quite bleak, unfortunately.
So many things, Hayat. Thank you so much for your sincere opinion. Thank you, Omid, and thank you so much, Bente, for what I think was a very informative evening. And indeed, this is what we try to avoid. We don't want to accept that nothing can be done. This is something we cannot live with. And despite the very severe humanitarian situation and the practices in Syria, to not take a blind eye to it. We have a responsibility as a government, as a civil society, in order to exercise this pressure on our own government and on the European institutions. And with these events, we try to keep awareness alive that what is happening in Syria, about the suffering, and that we have a responsibility on how refugees are feeling in Europe. And behind this backdrop, I hope that this event has given you some hope, because there are people that are speaking out against injustice in London, in Syria itself, in the German parliament, in the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. And in that sense, so many thanks for your contributions to the chat. And under questions and answers, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation has a lot of information that we provide on our website. Please visit our website. We have tried to place a few links in the chat. And now I wish you all a nice evening. Relax a little bit after this heat, and so many thanks to London, to Hayat. Thank you, Omid, and all the best, Bente. Keep on working. We try to make this change possible. All the best. Bye-bye.